Welcome everyone. I am really pleased to welcome you all to today's webinar, Race to Zero, How Finance Can Tackle the Climate Crisis. I'm Jessica Friis, Exec Chair of A4S. Today we're going to be exploring the role that finance plays in responding to the climate crisis. We know that time is running out and climate change that we are already facing is going to have significant impact on our economy, our lives and our livelihoods. But there is still a narrow window where we can take action and mitigate the worst impacts. This year, the UK is hosting COP26, the United Nations Climate Conference. More and more businesses and governments are committing to net zero and joining the race to zero and the race to resilience. Today, I'm pleased to be welcoming a number of speakers who are principal partners and net zero champions to be sharing some of the practical insights that they have been taking and recommendations for actions that all of you might be able to think about. I'm also pleased that today we'll be launching a number of practical guides to help finance teams to respond to the crisis. Before I introduce our panelists, I am delighted to welcome His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, who has shared a special message setting out his thoughts and his call to action. So I'm pleased to hand over to His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to take a few minutes of your time, if I may, to ask you as finance professionals across countries and industries to lend your expertise, your energy and leadership to develop and implement the practical solutions we need to build an ambitious and sustainable future that puts nature, people and planet at the heart of what is quite literally a race to zero. I need hardly say that your support, your influence and the impact you could have if you decide to join me in this would be utterly invaluable. Over the past year, the devastating pandemic has had a horrifying impact on lives and livelihoods everywhere. Reflecting on all that and all that we have endured together, it is more clear than ever that human health, economic health and planetary health are fundamentally interconnected, and that we must find ways to build back sustainably. Earlier this year, my Sustainable Markets Initiative launched the Terra Carta, a blueprint setting out ways to bring prosperity into harmony with nature, people and planet over the coming decade. The Terra Carta reflects the considerable progress that has been made in forging consensus on the direction humanity must take and the milestones we must meet by the middle of the century to secure a sustainable future. CEOs from organizations large and small have signed the Terra Carta, signaling their support for this roadmap towards a sustainable future by 2030. You never know, your CEO might just want to add his or her name to the list. I've also been encouraged by the growing number of governments, businesses and finance leaders committing to net zero. As finance professionals, I can only ask that you add your voice to these leaders and sign the A4S Net Zero Statement of Support to signal your commitment to the kind of action on the ground that we so desperately need to see. I hate to say this, but I've spent much of the last 40 years trying to get across the message about why sustainability matters and why tackling the twin existential threats of climate change and biodiversity loss is so utterly critical to the future of our entire global economy and humanity itself. Frankly, I'm fed up with all the talking. We know now what needs to be done. The big global investors have been telling me there is no shortage of money, which is hardly surprising, I suppose, as much of it has come from overexploiting nature So now we need to put some of that money back into supporting and regenerating nature's own capital, so that we can then draw a durable income from it for the future, but within planetary boundaries. Setting targets are, of course, only the first steps. They must sit alongside an extraordinary practical effort to mobilize the financial resources, technical ingenuity, and institutional innovation required to realize these goals. You, ladies and gentlemen, as CFOs, accountants, investors, and pensions professionals, have an essential role to play in driving the urgent and substantial change required. Your ability to raise and allocate funds for transition and adaptation, to embed greenhouse gas reductions within your organization's decision-making processes, to influence others and to track and report on progress against these targets places you at the very heart of the transition. I need hardly say that it would help a great deal if you could use your vital expertise and your teams to help support the work of the sector task forces in my Sustainable Markets Initiative as we examine financing the transition by industry and as we look at industry standards and metrics. This is precisely why I set up my Accounting for Sustainability project back in 2004, in order to work directly with you as finance leaders to inspire action and drive a fundamental shift towards resilient business models and a sustainable circular bioeconomy rather than a fossil economy. Therefore, after 17 years of trying to get the message across, it is time for real action to tackle the emergencies we face on all fronts. Thus, working closely with my SMI, A4S can help you not only to set ambitious targets, but also to form part of the coalition of the willing I've been putting together over the last 16 months, joining the race to zero, looking at corporate impact on nature, and finding the practical approaches that can deliver the solutions we need. As I've said before, this is not about making money on the one hand and being sustainable on the other. It is all about recognizing that business as usual is no longer an option, and that those organizations which invest in the future by putting nature, people, and planet at the heart of global value creation will be the ones to succeed. As we look to a brighter and hopefully more sustainable future, with our promises kept, I would be most grateful if we could join forces, join up all the dots, and waste no more time. The clock is ticking, and it really is up to us to make each day count.
So thanks to His Royal Highness for sharing his opening thoughts. I am now pleased to introduce the first of our panellists, Andrew Griffith. Andrew is the UK's net zero business champion, and his role is to support UK businesses of all sizes to make credible plans to net zero by 2050 or earlier. Now, Andrew has a background in business before moving into government, and actually was the CFO of Sky. So I think we'll bring a lot of useful insights to the conversation. So welcome, Andrew.
Hi, Jessica. Good morning. It's lovely to be here.
To get us going, can you say a bit more about why businesses, and particularly the finance community, should care about COP26? I mean, most will hopefully be aware of it, but not everyone.
Absolutely. Well, look, I think His Royal Highness put it very well in terms of the existential crisis that we face. But before we despair, what we've actually got is this wonderful opportunity, something that John Kerry has called the world's last best chance to solve it. we can see a number of countries around the world, including the UK, have already made really ambitious pledges to decarbonise. The level of that ambition can get us down to global warming of no more than 1.5 degrees. That's implicit in all of the targets that we set ourselves. And business in particular can be this wonderful problem-solving force that's going to help, on the one hand, lend its voice between now and COP. So we know what COP is. COP is when the world leaders, and we really do mean the world leaders, descend on Glasgow. It's the UN Committee Conference of the Parties. That's what COP stands for. It took me a while to have that explained to me, but it's the 26th Conference of the Parties. It's a UN subcommittee, and it is the whole world. So we have that wonderful moment where we can marshal leadership from our entire planet. In the run-up to that, businesses of every size have an opportunity to lend their voice, to make the pledges, to give our leaders the confidence to go a little bit further than they might otherwise have done, encourage them to go further than they otherwise would have done, and then, of course, to be part of the solution thereafter. I'll try and keep my comments short, Jessica, but that's the big picture about why we should care. And there is so much that we can do as finance professionals. I mean, we're really, really central to this.
Fantastic, thanks, Andrew. And I think we'll come back to some of those questions, and I'm sure that there will be some Q&A from the audience as well to hear more about what the government is doing. But I think that's a really nice segue to be introducing the rest of our panelists, CFOs from the Principal Partners. So to introduce all of them together, we have Andy Agg, the CFO of National Grid, Gregor Alexander, SSE, Katie Murray from NatWest Group, and Simon Robson from Sky. And a number of the CFOs in the panel. So Andy, Katie and Gregor are all also part of our CFO leadership network. And I know that all of you bring huge experience and are really grappling with, within your own businesses, how to achieve the race to zero, what you can do within your organization, but also in terms of the wider community. So Gregor, Andy, if I could come to you first, you both represent CFOs from the energy sector, so really at the heart of the transition to a net zero economy. Can you say what the race to zero means for you and some of the key actions that you as CFOs are taking? Gregor, if you could get us going, that would be great.
Okay, thanks, Jessica. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, I mean, you're dead right. Electricity is key to the transition to net zero, because once we take carbon out of electricity, which I think we will achieve by the middle of next decade, hopefully, then electricity becomes the energy source that decarbonizes other sectors of the economy, especially transport and heat. And I think transport and heat will need a lot more focus over the next couple of years. We're starting to see it in heat, and we'll see how that develops. I mean, on your question, race to zero, it is a key initiative because tackling climate change is just too important just to leave it to the politicians. Sorry, Andrew, no offense, but we all have to be involved. And we understand that COP26 is a diplomatic exercise. It's a meeting of nation states, obviously, to collaborate on climate change. But what Race to Zero does is to say that there are many non-state actors who also have a job to do in tackling climate change, and they must collaborate too. The business ambition for 1.5 degrees is, of course, the business part of Race to Zero, and I genuinely believe it captures the imagination of many business leaders across the economy. And as a result, businesses across the world are making their own pledges and settling targets to cut emissions on a pathway consistent with global warming of no more than 1.5 degrees. SSE is just one of those companies. And final question on, about action. I think the kind of key points I would kind of point out is, last week the Climate Change Committee published its 2021 progress report to government. At the heart of that report is recognition that while the right targets are usually important, ultimately it's action that matters. And SSE as a company has been at the forefront, and I've been CFO almost 19 years. I've been leading a lot of that kind of action. And it's that action that we must all be judged on by governments and by businesses. That's where I think the business community can demonstrate its ability to get things really done. In SSE, we're in the business of positive, practical action that tackles climate change. At the core of that is our rapid deployment at scale of offshore wind. Right now, we're building, alongside our joint venture partners, the world's largest wind farm, 3,600 megawatts at Dogger Bank. And we're constructing more offshore wind than any other company globally. I think that's a fantastic message for a UK company. And like Grid, we're investing billions in the electricity networks so they can cope with the demands of the electricity system that is doing most of the heavy lifting in decarbonising the other sectors. And of course, as most people here will recognise, the role of the CFO and our finance teams is to work behind the scenes to make sure all of that happens smoothly. To support the business case, ensure risks identified and managed, and to deliver the finance for investments. I think that's really important. That's all I was going to say. I'm going to pass you on to Andy, who I'm sure will add a few words of wisdom.
Thanks, Gregor. Yeah, Andy, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, and hello everybody. Great to be here as well. And I mean, what I will do, I want to add to Gregor as opposed to repeat, because we, National Grid very much in a similar sector to SSE, and many of the things that Gregor's talked about the energy transition are absolutely critical to us as well. I think in terms of the race to zero, as you go back to the heart of this, that's very much a collaborative campaign. We need to work together. And in our sector, in energy, that's making sure that companies like us, we work with government, with our regulators, and with all our stakeholders. And that includes investors. And as CFO, clearly that linkage to both our providers of capital, whether that's equity capital or debt capital, is critical to making sure we can deliver this transition as well. I think, as Gregor said, we need to design, build, and operate the infrastructure that we need to connect the renewables, connect all forms of low and zero carbon generation. But we also need to make sure we finance the innovation needed to run the network in a different way. And that's a critical part of the journey as well for us as the energy sector itself transitions in its entirety. Really, just as CFO, Gregor touched on this again, I think that point around really making sure that the targets that the businesses need to deliver are baked in to our day-to-day activities. So stopping it being something else that we think about over here and actually being a core part of how we manage our business, whether that's how we budget, how we forecast, how we report our performance, just like we've always done with financials, really. I think I'd also say as CFO, there's a role for us to really champion sustainability in this agenda at the board level. So as we're thinking about those key investment decisions that we need to make, and as Greg said, we're investing billions of pounds a year to achieve this. We've got to be very disciplined where we spend that money. And I think making sure that we're bringing sustainability into that decision making and making sure that the net zero agenda is being considered is critical. And finally, how we engage them with our investors, as I said at the start, those who are going to provide ultimately the capital to us or lend the capital to us to allow us to make those investments. It's critical that we share our plans and we're open about the journey, and we listen to our capital providers as well. And the CFO, we're a critical part of that conduit to and from the board to make sure we each know where expectations lie. So I see all of those really as natural extensions of the CFO role that we've all seen it as historically. It's not something new, it's just a natural extension into this space, and it's critical to make sure we can all deliver on our responsible business commitments.
Thanks, Andy. Katie, Andy was touching there on the role of capital providers. Now, as a bank, of course, that's one of the biggest impacts contributions that you can make to achieving net zero and driving the transition forward. Can you say a bit more about what NatWest is doing to help your customers, whether business or individuals, to reach net zero?
Yeah, no, sure. Thanks, Jessica, and sort of good afternoon, good morning, everyone, and wherever you are, and thanks for kind of dialing in. Look, as a bank, you know, we very much work on championing the potential that sits in our business, and making sure that it's guiding a lot of our decisions as we go through. You know, we're very committed to working with our customers to help them go on this transition. And for me, there's two key elements of that. It's around accelerating the speed of transition through the zero carbon economy, through working with and helping our customers, so thereby reducing the number of gaps. I think secondly, also helping to end the most harmful activity and championing those climate solutions by aligning our portfolio and our lending with the Paris alignment targets. There's lots of things that we're doing in a kind of practical level as to how we go through that, and I'll share kind of a couple just to kind of give a sense of the broadness of the activity. You know, in terms of working with the likes of our mortgage customers, we've got some preferential mortgages, where if your house is a EPC rating A or B, which is the UK rating as to how we measure the energy impact of a house, and if you're buying into that category, then actually you'll find that you're able to get a preferential mortgage. That was launched late last year in the last quarter, and what we can see, it's becoming an important part of our new mortgage flow as it kind of really begins to build up. But what we know, particularly here in the UK, is our housing stock, and as I look out of my window here in North London, it's old. You know, it's all kind of Victorian age stock. So actually, how do we work with customers to bring the housing stock up to what we call an EPC rating? So better than ERF, but not quite as good as the brand new rating. We've got a target to get 50% of the UK and the Republic of Ireland stock there by 2030. At the end of 2020, we're at about 36%. And you think, well, that sounds quite good. But the reality is, of course, a lot of houses won't have been rated in that time. So it's kind of 36% of what we know. So how do we work with customers? And this is where people like Andrew become really important, because actually a lot of it will come down to policy change as well, in terms of gas boilers that we have sitting in our houses, what we do on double glazing and things like that to really kind of help that piece. But I think what's really important is the education work that we're doing, because a lot of companies, you know, they don't know what to do, how to kind of start. We're one of the biggest lenders, you know, to SMEs in the country, and certainly the biggest kind of corporate lender. And we're doing a lot of work in terms of that education, whether it be through a small app for Kogo, which allows individuals to measure their carbon, or we've also joined forces with Microsoft to kind of help business customers understand and reduce their carbon footprints. And I really believe so much of this comes from understanding. So actually, what can you do in terms of as you move forward on that? You know, and there's other things. We work with Octopus Energy, so you get preferential rates in terms of getting your energy from suppliers who are more wind. I hear what being said at SSE, and I'm sure that Gregor's got some views of actually how sustainable the big firms can be, as well as some of the smaller kind of niche players and things like that. You know, we're also committing more funding. So we said we'd do £20 billion of funding by the end of 2021. We've done 12. We did 12 by the end of 20. We think that we'll probably exceed the 20 billion this year. So there's a huge appetite out there. But I do think it's working with customers to help them understand and know what's available as how they move forward, so that we can really help them transition and end some of the most harmful activity. Thanks, Jessica.
Fantastic, thanks, Katie. And we've got some fantastic questions coming in. I'm going to try, as we go through the discussion, to get to as many as we possibly can. So do keep them coming. Before turning to some of those questions, Simon, I'd like to hear from you. And actually, one of the questions talks as well about the role of the media. So Sky is one of the world's biggest media companies. Can you say more about your focus in the race to zero, both as an organisation and as a CFO? And picking up on that question, you know, part of it, of course, is also tackling what the questioner talks about as denialism or delayism. So yeah, love to hear more about Sky's focus.
Sure. Hi, Jessica, welcome, and morning, everyone. Look, we love at Sky, we love a big, bold, ambitious target, right? And so we as a business love that, and we as a finance department particularly love that. So we're a signatory to the Race to Zero. through the Business Ambition for 1.5 Degrees Coalition. And whilst it's really interesting hearing what other industries are doing that are very different to Sky, but for Sky, what are a few of the things we're committing to? We're committed to achieving net carbon zero by 2030. What we're going to do as part of that is we're focusing on our products, making all our products that are in customers' homes more energy efficient. We focus on what we think are going to be the world's most sustainable film and TV studios that we have. And also on our fleet. We have a huge fleet of vehicles across the UK and on making that a zero emission fleet. So we're doing all those. The sort of first thing we do is changing how we operate and focusing on those things. But then maybe to your point, as a media company, what we also do is use our voice and use our voice as a broadcaster. So we're trying to engage the public. We're a storyteller at the end of the day as a media business. So we're trying to engage the public first and foremost with many of the campaign work that we're doing. But we're also trying to engage and mobilize 35,000 employees across all of our businesses and ultimately 24 million customers, plus their friends, their families. And if we can mobilize all of that, and in addition to about 11,000 suppliers, then I think Sky, as a media company, can make a huge impact on this. The CFO, very similar to the other guys, look at its simplest, my job is to prioritize resources and make sure we get behind this stuff. Also I sort of see my job not just as CFO, but as sort of pen holder for the budget, for the planning, for the forecasting, and for the agenda of the executive team. So my job is to get it front and foremost, I think, as Andy was saying, of all the executive team's mind, to make sure people understand what we're doing, why we're doing, and how and why we're putting resources into those places across the business, and critically ensuring that the executive team knows what each of their roles is, because it's not just finance, it's not just the comms team, it's not just the PR, it's all of Sky and all of the executive team. So my job is to make sure everyone understands what they're needed to do and why they're doing it.
Fantastic, thanks, Simon. So Andy, if we could pick up on some of the questions that we're getting in, and particularly there's quite a few touching on credibility of commitments, and we've had some in advance as well, looking at a lot of companies are setting longer term targets, so 2050 targets, but actually it's some of the short term actions, and we know that really the next decade is when a lot of the decisions need to happen that'll determine the future. So can you say a bit more about that internal decision-making process, how you're really allocating investment funds to drive the outcomes, and then what you can do and other CFOs can do to give confidence? Is it about assurance? Is it about, what is it that will make your customers, your stakeholders really trust that what you're saying is happening?
Yeah, sure, thanks. And I think, as you've already heard, how businesses need to contribute to the race to zero will differ depending on which sector we're in, what our operations are. But there are some common things, as we've heard, but there are some sector specific, and you've heard some of the things we're doing in energy, for example. I think to answer your question, though, in particular, I think transparency is critical, whether you're talking about long-term commitments or short-term targets. And one of the things National Grid has done just for the first time this year is publish a comprehensive responsible business charter, which set out our targets, both for the years ahead and for the decades ahead. And first and secondly, then into this summer, we've produced our first responsible business report, which is a public document where we report delivering against those targets. We publish it alongside our annual report, so just as much importance as our financial performance. And we've committed to continue to do that. And I think that's absolutely critical, back to your credibility point, that we're holding ourselves to account. And then further, we'll be putting to our AGM next month a shareholder vote in terms of the approval of our climate policy going forward. And I think that shows again our commitment in front of our key stakeholders like our own investors, to make sure that they understand the journey and they hopefully are supportive of the commitments we've made. And then I think bring it back internally, but in terms of the CFO's role, and I echo some of the points that Simon just made. This needs to be threaded right through how we manage our business day to day, how we set our long-term plans, how we set annual budgets, how we track forecasts, and every time John and I, the CEO, we sit down with our businesses to look at our performance, whether it's monthly, quarterly, we're having a conversation about our emission reduction targets just as much as we are about our financial performance. And that's a critical part going forward.
Fantastic, thanks, Andy. Katie, another theme that we're seeing coming through from the questions is the role of investors and others in terms of supporting organisations. Now, one element of that for banks is, of course, the reliance that both investors and banks have on the information that you get from your customers to be able to report and take action yourself. Now, one of the things that we're doing today is launching 2 guides. So one specifically for banks and the finance teams within banks, one that is general and relevant across all sectors. Can you say a bit more about how you as a bank and where relevant to other organisations are going about that whole process of measuring, tracking, reporting your emissions across the full value chain, and how that might link to reducing your exposure and financing around the whole fossil fuel economy or high carbon emitting? How are you actually reconciling that race to zero in terms of your full value chain?
No, thanks, Jessica. And it builds on a lot of what Andy has said already. But what we did in 2020 was we took our balance sheet, and for banks, the RWA is the kind of the shorthand for the capital metrics. So we went to say, look at where all of our RWAs are invested, and actually let's pick 4 areas to really try to work out what the carbon impact is of those 4 areas. So we looked at agricultural farming, we looked at mortgages, which for us is the single biggest class on the balance sheet. We looked at oil and gas extraction. Well, not a big exposure for us. It's obviously some of the most harmful in terms of what they did. And we also looked at automotive manufacturing. So that covered about 45% of the balance sheet. So you then get a view as to actually what does it mean working with those customers, doing some very clever maths with a lot of the modelling guys to see actually what's that carbon impact. And then you've got a base to then start to have the conversations to say to our commercial business, for example, to say, okay, this is, we know the carbon that comes out with these businesses. What are you doing to help them on transition? And it's not about saying, no, we'll just stop funding. That's the easiest, but it's also the quickest way to kind of shrink to zero in terms of their own sustainability of the business. But actually, how do you move forward? So working with them to say, like, what's your three-year plan of transition? What funding can we do? What can we do in terms of learning about how you measurement, which is why the Microsoft tie-up is really important as well. And then I think it's really, as Andy says, it's about not having it as a conversation that happens on the side. These things always happen in big businesses. One of your comments earlier said, why is it taking so long for it to happen? But they happen slowly in big businesses, and then they start a project. You need to get out of that project room and into the main conversation, so that we're talking to the head of commercial, the head of mortgages, and actually saying, right, guys, this year your plan's going to be not just how much capital you consume, but also how much carbon you consume. And we've got good maths for 4 areas. We'll do another couple more areas this year. And the maths won't be perfect, it won't be ideal, but it'll be better than it was. And so therefore it's about the kind of incremental improvement. And I think a lot of the targets we put out are really big. So, and they can be quite daunting because of the size of those targets, 50% reduction by 2030, sorry. But let's work out how we do 5% and 10% and 15% so that you see that real kind of incremental improvement. So it's very much around understanding where we've got real data and improving in those spaces, working out how you get to the real data. And then I think, again, it's working with government and public policy to say, actually, we've all got a role to play in this in terms of how do we actually make some of the real kind of changes that are going through. But it's just a constant, I think, publishing of your commitments, which we did as well this year, like Andy did at National Grid, and then updating on them, both internally and also externally to kind of moving forward. So it all comes back to data, which is why I think for the finance community, this is a really exciting time, because it's what we do really well and actually kind of make where it's our real ability to drive real business change in a way that will leave a legacy beyond our own times in these seats.
Thanks, Katie. And we've had a few questions touching on some of that and how the role of the accountant and finance professional might change in the future. And that's certainly something that we see. I do think that finance is really needing to, and has that opportunity to broaden their skill set, and something that is a real focus of A4S's work. How can we build that capacity to respond? Andrew, I'd like to come back to you. Katie and a number of the other CFOs have touched on that role of data reporting. One of the aims of COP26 is to accelerate adoption of global corporate reporting standards around climate. We've also had quite a lot of questions coming in on the role of government, particularly to support SMEs to respond, and also what it might mean in terms of tax incentives. So if you could pick up firstly on that question of corporate reporting and the aims of COP26, and if you have anything additional to add around some of briefly the broader support for SMEs.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Jessica. I'll add a few things first, if I may. I mean, the first is, this is the most absolute fantastic opportunity for business, right? There's lots of societal changes and undercurrents going on. The pandemic's probably amplified some of those. It is incredibly important that we remind people about the problem solving, do-gooding, centrality of business to our lives. It is business that's created the vaccine. It's the business that kept us fed. It's the business that keeps the hospitals working. And it's a really important issue for us to step into and demonstrate that business is really engaged in this issue. And by so doing, we'll be generating lots of proof points about the positive role. The same is true of finance, even more so, because ultimately this is a resource optimization problem, right? That'll get everyone's juices flowing at 10:30 in the morning. But this is about making best use of scarce resources in our environment, on our planet, but also in our own individual enterprises. And we know that finance is good at that. That we're central to that debate. And again, we can take real positions of leadership within our organizations. One of the best ways in that we can all take action on climate is reducing waste. And so that is highly aligned to the CFO's agenda. Historically, we may have approached that from a bottom line perspective. Now we can approach it from a fully baked bottom line perspective, because we just don't want all of that rework throwaway, because that's taking a great toll on the environment. So reporting is a big piece of it, because we do need common standards. We need a common lexicon and nomenclature. We need to be able to talk about these the way that we can all talk about, pounds or customers or sales. The UK is mandating, as a result of the climate financial disclosure work, it's going to mandate that by 2025. Many sectors will go earlier and apply that by 2023. That makes us the first G20 country to do so. So encourage other G20 countries to do so as well. There's no pride in that, but it does mean that it will fall to all of us, and that means us. Don't, for goodness sake, let it just fall to government, because they'll get it wrong. To write those new green lexicons, the new green taxonomy that talks about how we do that, and that will give us a brilliant tool, a really brilliant tool, to go back and look through supply chains, to work with them and work with SMEs who maybe don't have the bandwidth to come up with the green taxonomy. They're running for the hills as we speak. But it will give us an ability to work out where our footprints sit and how to abate that. And clearly we all have to do that together. Government will have to do that both itself, but also as a procurer. Government is a big part of the economy. And it has a supply chain as well that it needs to work with. In terms of tax breaks, look, I think you've got a number of things, and I'm not the Chancellor, and I'm not going to get myself into trouble by front running a whole load of initiatives. There is a lot of help already out there. A lot of that is focused on people who are at the cutting edge of coming up with solutions. There is this fantastic thing called the Net Zero Innovation Fund. And that applies to processes that can really be quite small, because it's the aggregation of marginal gains, as my friend Simon knows, that's actually going to help us solve this. So there's a lot of money going into the system. It's directed at particular problem-solving solutions today. Once we've got those, and in many sectors we have, then we can look at scaling them. And the biggest thing that small businesses tell me is they just want help, right? I mean, they've got a good level of awareness. They actually have the latent desire. They've often got really deep relationships with their customers. So they've been engaged in this agenda for quite a long time, whether it was called the circular economy or other previous iterations. But what they really want are case studies and someone to hold their hand and give them a little bit of education. Some of the interventions that I'm sponsoring are aimed at precisely that. Things like the Google Garage, the Business Climate Hub website that has some very easy steps that everybody can take. And there'll be a lot more of that coming.
Fantastic. Thanks, Andrew. Gregor, one of the questions that we've had is whether large investors are asking about the race to zero and willing to invest the funds needed to drive the transition. Can you say a bit more about your dialogue with your investors, whether you're really seeing a focus on this? Are the questions focused into the detail of what kind of technologies might be needed? There's quite a few questions on the different technologies that might be part of the transition. And then finally, the human impact. So there's quite a lot of discussion around just transition. And I know that that's an area that you've been thinking about a lot. So I'd love to hear a bit more on what the dialogue you might have had with investors, but also other stakeholders around the just transition.
Jessica, yeah, look, I mean, I think there's no doubt in my mind over the last couple of decades, we've seen a huge amount of movement, and then the last 2 or 3 years, even bigger movement. We kind of financial crisis in 2008 impacted on that kind of direction of travel, clearly slowed us down. But actually, I think COVID has refocused the whole financial community on net zero. And to be frank, so they should. As Larry Fink puts it, climate risk is a financial risk that everyone should be focusing on. In terms of targets, I mean, we get a lot of questions on our carbon intensity, our kind of glide path to how we're going to reduce, because we're right across the spectrum. We're the biggest renewables business in the UK, but also we're a big thermal generator. And actually, we think the technology in thermal is really important. Some of our competitors sold out because they felt that was better for the credentials. Carbon capture and hydrogen are going to be big players going forward for particularly the UK, and we will need clean thermal fleets going into the next decade. So we're very much part of that. And I think overall, I would say that the acceleration of that focus from investors is really driving the discussion. So we're having a more detailed discussion on some of those technicalities. Not everyone likes carbon capture, I understand that, but we're having a sensible discussion with investors and other parties on how we take that forward. I think just as importantly, in my view, is the just transition. I think it's really important. And actually, SSE has been at the forefront. We were one of the first companies to publish a just transition report with 20 action points. And not in our focus on energy systems, electricity grids, big engineering projects, and our huge assets, we must remember that there are human consequences of the transition to net zero. There are clearly big social implications. We're going to be able to create a huge amount of jobs, but there will be costs associated with that. And looking at how we deliver net zero in a way that it's fair for workers, communities, and consumers. And let's be clear, net zero is going to have a cost that has to be passed on to consumers, and governments going forward are going to have to think about how they deal with that. We've got to kind of manage that and actually ensure that consumers and ultimately voters understand that net zero is providing benefits for the long run. So it's not just for businesses, but it's for government and policymakers to lead. And that's why, you know, at SSE, we published the Just Transition Strategy, because we know we're an agent for influence, and we can do things that can help. For example, we are attracting a number of workers from the high carbon sectors, and we are, particularly in our renewables business, our offshore wind renewables business, where there's quite a good crossover, attracting significant proportion in there. And the other areas, we're working with suppliers to boost the domestic content in offshore wind, where thousands of jobs are created. And you know, I go back to 2007, actually, when I was on a podium, and it was with politicians saying, look, we're going to focus on that supply chain. And we didn't really create that supply chain in the UK. Now we're really on top of it. I think that will create a lot of opportunities and jobs to take things forward. And from a business perspective, the reason it's important is public consent underpins every action and investment that we want to make. And if the benefits of those investments are not shared, or is uneven distribution of the costs, then we don't have legitimacy for those investments. So I see that as really important over the next 5-10 years as we move through a really important part of the net zero transition.
Thanks, Gregor. Simon, if I can come to you next, and that question of the right knowledge and skills. One, I'd love to hear more about what you're doing to upskill your team and finance teams within Sky, but also we've had some questions for what would your advice be to undergraduates and students who are wanting to pursue an accounting career? So for Sky or for other businesses, what kind of attributes would you be looking for in this area that might help them have successful careers as accountants tackling some of these issues?
Sure. Look, I think certainly for finance professionals in Sky, and I'm sure listening to the others similar across all industries, I think this challenge over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years is right up finance people's and accounting people's streets. Honestly, I'm not trying to fudge those together. I think it is all about what finance people live for and do really well. I think the quote sort of natural behaviors of finance people are perfectly aligned with this. And therefore the way we think, the way we behave as finance people is going to enable this. I'm certain of that. If I think about what I think good finance people do really well, I think it helps. So what do they do well? I think we're naturally curious people. We ask a lot of questions, we dig in, and that means we help provide us a lot of solutions. We get people to think again. And we sometimes, people have a solution. When finance get involved, we may change or tweak that solution. At the very least, we'll ask them to reconsider that solution. We have a healthy dose of cynicism, so we're not easily convinced. And what that does is we don't say no, we say why. And what that does is make sure plans are really robust. And what's going to be important over this period is that plans are robust. It doesn't mean they won't change, they will change. Plans will change over time. But what finance people can do is ensure when we change, we know why, and that we move to a good new plan. And look, we track and report. And whilst, you know, I wouldn't write the marketing literature for our undergraduate recruitment campaign by saying we track and report, but tracking and reporting is, I think a few people have mentioned it, and the transparency of that is absolutely critical to this. And we hold the pen on that. We hold the pen with other organizations and with accounting bodies in terms of what we report externally, but internally, really importantly, we completely hold the pen. And what you find in any business is what the business focuses on is what's reported and what's shown to them, what's played back to them in weekly exec meetings, in board meetings, and what they're held accountable for. And we get to do that. So Whether that's in terms of the challenge of finding good reports, good KPIs, and tracking and monitoring that well, which itself is fascinating, but also whether it's about how we communicate that and the action we steer from that. Those are things that finance people get to do, get to sit right at the front of the business and get to dictate how the business thinks and how it reports and how it focuses, which ultimately leads down to how we allocate resources, coming back to the point that Andrew and many others made. So look, as I say, I think this is super, super exciting for finance people. This is something we're going to lead. We're not just going to follow as a back office function. We're going to help lead this initiative. If nothing else, what finance people do well is we help the business achieve ambitious plans, right? So whilst there can be cynicism around the ambition and the level of plans in businesses, what finance people will do with a cold, wet flannel over their heads is break it down into manageable chunks and say, right, it's okay, dear business, we'll do A, then we'll do B, then we'll do C, then we'll do D. We do all those things, we'll get to net carbon zero by 2030. So we provide that sort of level of thinking, if you like, that helps make it achievable. And I think that's just a really exciting position to be in. And therefore, what I'd say to undergraduates is, if you have an interest in the survival of the environment, of the economy, of the globe, then being in finance is going to put you right at the forefront of that piece of work. And I think it's going to be a fascinating, really exciting period for finance.
Brilliant, thank you, Simon. I think those are some fantastic words to be sharing and encouraging students to really focus on this agenda and contribute their skill sets to the urgent challenge that we face. Andy, thinking globally, climate is clearly a global challenge. We need a global response. What can you as a business with global operations, a global supply chain do to incentivize and drive action globally in terms of mitigating? But then also one of the other themes that is a real focus is the race to resilience. So we already know that we're going to suffer worse impacts from the physical consequences of climate already, in terms of what we've already baked into the system. And the longer we leave it to act, the worse that is going to be. So can you say more briefly, because we're nearly up to time, on those two dimensions?
Yeah, I think at one level, the opportunities in front of us and the challenges are no different wherever we operate. And obviously we have, nearly half our business today is in the United States, in the Northeast of the United States. And the issues there around the energy transition, we operate in states that have made equally binding commitments to get to net zero by 2050 or even earlier. And we're working very closely with the governments and regulators in those states to achieve that. But your point about resilience is important. We've seen greatly increased storm activity across our footprint, and we're investing hundreds of millions across the footprint to make sure that we both maintain and increase the resilience of our existing assets, while we still look at connecting the new energy. So Gregor's talked about offshore wind. That's a growing opportunity in the northeast of the US, and making sure the networks that we own and operate are ready to facilitate that as it starts to be built and come ashore, as well as onshore renewables build out as well. So both the protecting and the resilience of existing infrastructure to deal with the changes, as well as making sure we're investing for the future generation mix as we move towards that low carbon.
Thanks, Andy. We've got about 6 minutes left, so I'm going to sneak in one final question from the audience, and then to give you all a heads up, I'm going to come to each of you just for your one soundbite in terms of if there's one key action, one key hope that you have, what that might be. So the final question, and something that has been, I know is something that everyone is really grappling with, and is pretty controversial, is offsetting. A lot of businesses are including offsetting as part of their net zero targets. We know that globally, we need to get to really a global net zero by mid-century, and actually carbon negative. We need to be taking more out than we're putting in to stabilize the climate for the second half of the century. So offsetting may be a temporary part of the solution, but it absolutely is not a long-term answer. And within our guidance, we share a little bit more about some of the emerging work to give more guidance on how to think about what is credible reduction, removal, rather than something that really doesn't get to the heart of the problem. Who has a really brief answer? Andrew, on that.
Thank you, Jessica. The key thing to me is that you do that behind a really credible set of targets. So absolutely make sure you're signed up to something like the Race to Zero, and that you've got those plans in place, that you've stretched the organization, and that it's a really high quality partner that you're working with. Within those parameters, there absolutely is a role for this, because it's optimizing and it's making best use of your capital resources. And initiatives now like LEAF is one that I've been working with, and the UK government is fully supporting. There are high quality, well reported, well trackable offset initiatives out there. So it's not, I don't think it's at the either extreme. I don't think we should conduct the debate at the extremity, but make sure in every aspect, as you do elsewhere in your business, that you're pursuing this with a high quality and from a position of strength. Jessica, I've got to jump onto another call any moment. So I just wanted to thank A4S for bringing this really important group together. And my one wish is that as many people as possible use this moment in time to start the journey. No one has to finish the journey, but please don't look back with hindsight and say, I wish I could have done something now. There was this moment in the run up to COP, and I didn't act. I was a little bit timorous and a little bit late. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andrew. Now I'll come now to everyone else with their key takeaway. Andy, coming to you first.
Yeah, I think in our sector, in the energy sector, COP26 is a fantastic opportunity to show that business can come together with government, with our regulators and with other stakeholders to really set out a clear path, joining up policy commitments with actions and investment commitments to make sure we can get there. I think I'd love to make sure that we can continue to champion this inside our organisation, echoing some of the points Simon's made. And really, just to finish echoing Andrew's point, His Royal Highness mentioned the A4S Net Zero statement of support. I think it's a great opportunity for others to think about, signing up and showing their commitment to the journey we need to go on.
Thanks, Andy. And we can make that available to everyone after the event. Gregor.
Yeah, no, Jessica, agree with everything Andy was saying there. I think, from a hope point of view, I think consensus is going to be really important for the outcome COP26. If we don't have political consensus, then we're going to not meet some of those targets worldwide, and we need to get the joined up things. That is a key thing. From a SEC point of view, I'd love to be able to announce, our Corrie Glass pump storage scheme as part of COP26. That would be a fantastic message for 1,500 megawatts of pump storage that's needed in the UK to deal with all that offshore wind. So that'd be a really good green story. But that's a personal hope.
Thank you, Gregor. Simon.
No business can do this alone. So I'd say set ambitious targets, get everyone involved, and get started. Very simple. Brilliant.
And final word to you, Katie, before I wrap up.
I think my colleagues have said it all really well in terms of what COP26 would be, but for me, it's about getting started and getting help. And I think one really tangible thing that we can do as financial professionals is that we, between us collectively and all the people on this call, own and influence huge amounts of pension funds. And I would say at the moment, I think the investor community can add a bit more pressure than they are. And I notice the investors are investing as us, the ones that are most interested, is it? Because their mandates have changed from the companies who are managing. So I would say for everybody in here, get started, put where you have investments in under some pressure to really kind of help to make that kind of change. And I think, look, COP26 is about working together, and it's a moment, as Andrew said, of just actually getting involved and getting in there. So I would encourage everyone to do that along their entire value chain. Thanks, Jessica.
Fantastic. Thank you, Katie. And a final thanks to all of our panelists and His Royal Highness. We will share with everyone, and a recording of this will be available on our website. Please do have a look at the 2 guides released today. We'll be releasing a further one for pension fund trustees on Friday as part of the PLSA conference. So do look out for that as well. And as everyone said, we all have a role to play. It's essential that we really accelerate what we're doing and take action now. We can't wait. Thanks everyone, and thanks to all of our panelists.